January 17, 1944. Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. 0347 hours. The jungle breathes in darkness. A wet, living darkness that clings to skin and fills the lungs with the weight of rotting vegetation and salt-heavy air. In the perimeter defense line of the American 3rd Marine Division, Corporal James Hargrove crouches beside the cold steel tube of a M1A1 75mm pack howitzer, his hand steady on the traverse, while despite the tremor of anticipation, coursing through every man in the gun crew. The barrel points toward the tree line 200 yards distant, invisible now in the moonless night, but alive with sound, the rustle of movement, the crack of bamboo, the whispered cadence of Japanese voices carrying orders through the undergrowth. Hargrove can smell the gun oil mixed with his own sweat, can feel the volcanic soil of this godforsaken island pressing damp against his knees. Somewhere in that darkness, beyond the wire, beyond the killing ground his battery has ranged and registered throughout the previous day, soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army are massing for what their commanders have promised will be a decisive counterattack. They have been told the Americans are soft. They have been told American equipment is inferior. They have been told that spirit, the immortal Japanese spirit, forged in the divine wind of their ancestors, will overcome material advantage. In precisely 13 minutes, those soldiers will learn a terrible truth about the arithmetic of modern warfare. The story of that revelation begins not in the jungles of the South Pacific, but in the doctrines and illusions that shaped the Imperial Japanese Army throughout the 1930s and into the opening years of the Pacific War. The Japanese military establishment, hardened by brutal campaigns in Manchuria and China, had developed a tactical philosophy that placed overwhelming emphasis on infantry assault, night operations, close combat, and an indomitable fighting spirit they called Seishin. This was not mere propaganda. It was woven into the fabric of their training, their officer education, their entire conception of what made armies effective. Japanese infantry tactics stress infiltration, surprise, and the shock of cold steel, the bayonet charge, the midnight assault, the willingness to die rather than retreat. These are the pillars upon which Japanese commanders built their battle plans. Artillery, by contrast, occupied a peculiar position in this hierarchy of violence. The Imperial Japanese Army possessed artillery, certainly, 75mm field guns, 105mm howitzers and heavier pieces, but they were chronically under-resourced, poorly supplied with ammunition, and doctrinally subordinate to primacy of infantry action. Japanese artillery doctrine emphasized direct support of infantry assaults, conservation of ammunition due to logistical constraints, and acceptance that Japanese guns would almost always be outnumbered and outweighed by enemy fire support. This disparity was not accidental. It reflected the material realities of Japanese industrial capacity and the strategic choices made in Tokyo and at Imperial General Headquarters. Japan's economy, though modernized and militarized to the 1920s and 1930s, could not match the raw productive output of the United States. Where American factories would eventually produce artillery pieces by the thousands, Japanese arsenals struggled to equip their expanding armies with adequate numbers of guns. More critically, the logistics of supplying artillery with sufficient ammunition across the vast Pacific theater proved beyond Japan's capabilities. Ships that might have carried shells instead carried rice, fuel, and infantry reinforcements. Artillery units in the field were placed on strict ammunition rations, sometimes limited to mere dozens of rounds per gun per day, while their American counterparts could call upon virtually unlimited fire support. But material constraints alone do not explain the Japanese approach. There was a deeper cultural and military philosophy at work, a belief, genuinely held by many Japanese officers, that fighting spirit and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantage, that the warriors could defeat the merchant's wealth. This was the ideology that sent Japanese soldiers into battle, convinced that their courage would prevail over American steel. The soldiers gathering in the darkness beyond Corporal Hargrove's position had been fed this doctrine since their conscription. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto, a 23-year-old farmer's son from Fukuoka Prefecture, had joined the Imperial Army in 1941 with his head full of stories about the China incident, tales told by older men in his village who had served in the Guangdong Army. They spoke of Chinese armies that broke and ran, of easy victories and the glory of serving the emperor. Yamamoto's training had been brutal. The Japanese army made no concession to gentleness, but had instilled in him an absolute confidence in Japanese tactical superiority. His instructors had taught him that American soldiers were individualists, undisciplined, unwilling to endure hardship. They were factory workers and shopkeepers playing at war, men who would crumble when faced with soldiers who had embraced the way of the warrior. When Yamamoto's regiment deployed to the South Pacific in 1943, they carried with them this unshakable conviction. The early victories, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, seemed to confirm everything they had been told. But now, dug into the volcanic soil of Bougainville after months of grinding defensive combat, Yamamoto and his comrades were about to receive an education in the cold mathematics of firepower. The M1A1 75mm pack howitzer that waited in the darkness represented a distinctly American approach to the problems of warfare. Designed in the 1920s and refined to the 1930s, the 75mm pack howitzer was built for the United States Marine Corps with a specific purpose: to provide light, mobile, powerful fire support for amphibious and jungle operations where heavy artillery could not easily deploy. The gun could be broken down into 6 mule portable loads, each weighing less than 300 pounds, allowing it to be manhandled through jungle terrain, landed from small boats, or even dropped by parachute. Yet despite its light weight, barely 1,400 pounds in firing position, the 75mm pack howitzer threw a 14-pound high-explosive shell with devastating effect. Its maximum range exceeded 9,000 yards, though in the close jungle fighting of the Pacific Islands, it was typically employed at ranges under 2,000 yards, firing over open sights with brutal directness. The Marine Corps had embraced this weapon with characteristic enthusiasm, recognizing that in the island-hopping campaigns to come, infantry would need responsive, flexible, overwhelming fire support to break Japanese defensive positions and shatter counterattacks. By 1944, every Marine division included multiple battalions of pack howitzers, their crews trained to a level of proficiency that would have seemed incomprehensible to Japanese artillerymen operating under constant ammunition shortages and logistical chaos. But the gun itself was only part of the story. The true revolution in American artillery practice lay not in the tubes but in the system. The network of forward observers, fire direction centers, communication systems, and ammunition supply chains that turned individual guns into a responsive, synchronized instrument of destruction. American forward observers, usually junior officers or senior NCOs, advanced with the infantry, equipped with radios that could call down fire within minutes. Fire direction centers plotted targets, calculated firing data, and coordinated multiple batteries to mass fires on single points. Communication systems, from field telephones to the portable backpack radios that were becoming standard equipment, ensured that fire support could be requested, approved, and delivered with a speed that Japanese forces could not match. And behind it all, the American logistics system, that vast, unglamorous machinery of supply ships, ammunition dumps, truck convoys, and supply sergeants, ensured that guns never went silent for lack of shells. A Marine artillery battery on Bougainville in January 1944 could expect to fire hundreds, even thousands of rounds in a single engagement, each shell having traveled 6,000 miles from factories in Pennsylvania or Illinois across the Pacific on Liberty ships, through supply depots, and finally to gun position where crews waited to feed them into hungry britches. Private Yamamoto knew nothing of this as he crouched in the assembly area with his rifle across his knees, listening to his platoon leader outline the attack plan in terse whispers. The objective was simple: overwhelm the American perimeter in a swift night assault, seize their artillery positions, and create a breach through which follow-on forces could exploit. Yamamoto's company had been promised that preliminary artillery fire from their own guns would suppress American positions, but he had heard such promises before and had learned to place little faith in them. Japanese artillery was too precious, too scarce, too strictly rationed to provide the kind of crushing bombardments he imagined the Americans must enjoy. Still, he checked his bayonet one more time, felt the comforting weight of his Type 38 rifle, and drew on the training and indoctrination that had shaped him. Tonight, they would show the Americans what Japanese infantry could accomplish. Tonight, they would prove that spirit conquered steel. At 0400 hours, the Japanese artillery opened fire. Three Type 41 75mm mountain guns, positioned in concealed emplacements 3 miles behind the Japanese lines, began a slow, methodical bombardment of the marine perimeter. The guns fired at a rate dictated not by tactical needs but by ammunition constraints. 1 round every 2 minutes, a careful expenditure of irreplaceable shells. The explosions walked across the marine positions with a measured pace of metronome. Each detonation a brief flower of flame in the darkness. The Marine infantrymen, veterans of Guadalcanal and New Georgia, pressed themselves into their foxholes and waited. They had endured worse. After 20 minutes and 30 rounds total across 3 guns, the Japanese artillery fell silent. Their ammunition allocation for the night was expended. In American terms, this was not a bombardment. It was barely a harassment fire mission. But in Japanese terms, it represented a significant commitment of precious resources. Now it was the infantry's turn. Yamamoto rose with his platoon and began moving through the jungle toward the American lines. They advanced in near silence, a skill honed through countless hours of night training. The darkness was absolute, the footing treacherous with roots and volcanic rock, but they moved with the confidence of men who believed the night belonged to them. Japanese tactical doctrine held that American soldiers, with their dependence on radios and machinery, were blind and helpless in darkness. The plan was to infiltrate close to the American positions before launching the final assault, to get inside the range where American firepower could be brought to bear, to fight the kind of close-quarters battle where Japanese training and fighting spirit would dominate. It was a sound tactical concept, proven in China and in the early Pacific campaigns. But that was before the Marines had fully developed their defensive fire support procedures, before the integration of infantry and artillery had become the terrifying science that now waited in the darkness ahead. Corporal Hargrove heard the Japanese artillery fire and knew what was coming. Every Marine who had fought in the Pacific knew the pattern. A brief, weak bombardment followed by infantry assault. The gun crews stood to their weapons. The forward observer, Lieutenant Morrison, was already on the radio to the Fire Direction Center, confirming that pre-registered defensive fire concentrations were ready to be called. These concentrations had been carefully plotted the previous day. Points along likely approach routes where artillery fire could be quickly massed. Each concentration had been registered, meaning that a few ranging shots had been fired during daylight to confirm accuracy. Now those points existed as data in the Fire Direction Center's notebooks, ready to be executed on command. It was a system, a lethal calculus that reduced the chaos of battle to coordinates and timing. When the Japanese infantry emerged from the tree line, they would not be facing merely 6 75mm Howitzers scattered along the marine perimeter. They would be facing the integrated firepower of an entire artillery battalion, with every gun able to fire on any target within minutes. At 0425 hours, a Marine listening post 300 yards forward of the main line detected movement. The 2-man team had been lying motionless in a concealed position since nightfall, ears straining for any sound of Japanese infiltration. Now they heard it, the unmistakable noise of many men moving through jungle, the rustle of equipment, the snap of vegetation. The senior man keyed his radio twice in quick succession, a prearranged signal. Enemy infantry approaching in strength. In the Fire Direction Center, a young captain marked the time and waited. The protocol was clear. Let them come closer, let them commit to the attack, then crush them with mass fires while they were still in the jungle, away from the marine foxholes where close combat might neutralize the artillery advantage. Yamamoto felt the tension rising as his company neared the American perimeter. They had covered most of the distance through the jungle without being detected, or so it seemed. His platoon leader raised a hand, halting the advance. They were perhaps 200 yards from the American positions now, close enough to hear the faint sound of activity, the clink of equipment, the low murmur of English voices. In a few minutes they would launch the final assault, rushing across the remaining distance with bayonets fixed, overwhelming the American positions through speed and aggression. Yamamoto's heart pounded, his breath came quick and shallow, but his hands were steady. He had done this before. He would do it again. Around him, other soldiers readied themselves for charge. The platoon leader looked at his watch, counting down the seconds until the appointed time. In the Japanese tactical doctrine, synchronization was everything. all units attacking simultaneously to overwhelm the defense. It was 0433 hours. In 2 minutes, they would attack. At 0434 hours, Lieutenant Morrison gave the order, "Fire mission, concentration Delta 7. His voice was calm, almost conversational. In the Fire Direction Center, the captain repeated the command over the artillery net, and within seconds, 675mm Howitzers along a half-mile front began to traverse their barrels, cranking elevation wheels, loading rounds. The gun crews moved with practiced efficiency, each man knowing his role in the loading sequence. Number 1 man swabbed the bore. Number 2 man held the round. Number 3 man set the fuse. Number 4 man rammed it home. Number 5 man loaded the propellant charge. The gunner made final adjustments to lay, and the section chief pulled a lanyard. The first rounds left the tubes with sharp crack that shattered the night, a sound like enormous canvas tearing, followed by the whistle of shells arcing through darkness toward predetermined coordinates in the jungle. Yamamoto heard the sound, and in the split second before the first shells impacted, he knew terror. That sound, that particular shrieking whistle that grew louder and louder, was not the sound of random fire or harassing artillery. It was a sound of shells arriving in quantity, on target, with deadly precision. Then the world exploded. The first volley of 6 rounds detonated in a precise line to the Japanese assembly area, each shell bursting 10 feet above ground to maximize fragmentation effect. The 14-pound high-explosive shells contained over a pound of TNT and a steel casing designed to shatter into hundreds of lethal fragments. The detonations came in such rapid succession that they merged into a continuous roar, a wall of sound and blast and flying metal that tore through the jungle canopy and through the men waiting beneath it. Yamamoto threw himself flat, pressing his face into the volcanic soil, hands over his head in a futile gesture of protection. Around him, men were screaming high, animal sounds of shock and agony. The second volley landed before the echoes of the first had faded, then the third, then the fourth, and still they came, a drumbeat of destruction that seemed to have no end. In the Marine gun positions, the crews worked with mechanical precision, loading and firing in a rhythm that had been drilled into them through months of training. Each gun was firing at a rate of 4 rounds per minute, a sustainable pace that balanced speed with accuracy. 6 guns, 4 rounds per minute, 24 shells screaming into an area roughly 100 yards square every 60 seconds. The forward observer adjusted fire based on reports from the listening post and on sound, the distinctive noise of Japanese soldiers shouting commands, attempting to organize, trying to withdraw. He walked the fire back and forth across the suspected assembly area, ensuring saturation coverage. The ammunition was inexhaustible. Behind each gun position, crews had stacked dozens of rounds on wooden pallets, and behind them, trucks waited with hundreds more. If the battery fired every shell in its immediate inventory, more could be brought forward within the hour. This was a reality of American logistics, a reality so divorced from Japanese experience that it seemed almost supernatural. After 5 minutes of continuous fire, 144 high-explosive shells had impacted the Japanese assembly area. The jungle, which had been a living cathedral of ancient trees and dense undergrowth, was now a wasteland of shattered timber and torn earth. Fires burned where shell bursts had ignited vegetation. The ground was cratered, the trees stripped of branches, and the air was thick with smoke and the chemical stink of high explosives. Of Yamamoto's platoon, 42 men, perhaps 15 were still combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or so thoroughly shell-shocked that they could not function. The company's attack had been shattered before it reached the line of departure, broken not by opposing infantry or by hand-to-hand combat, but by an impersonal rain of steel that had fallen from the night sky with mathematical precision. Those Japanese soldiers who could still move began crawling back toward their own lines, dragging wounded comrades, abandoning weapons and equipment. All thought of us all forgotten in the primal need to escape the killing zone. Yamamoto survived because he had been at the edge of the impact area when the barrage began. He crawled backward through the shattered jungle, his mind blank with shock, his training and indoctrination stripped away by the simple, overwhelming reality of having been under American artillery fire. He had expected combat. He had experienced combat, but nothing in his experience or training had prepared him for this kind of industrial-scale violence, this marriage of precision and overwhelming firepower. In previous battles, artillery had been a dangerous but tolerable element of the battlefield, something that killed unlucky men but could be endured by the majority. What he had just experienced was not artillery as he understood it. It was the annihilation of terrain and everything in it, a form of warfare that made individual courage and tactical skill almost irrelevant. When he finally reached his regiment's defensive positions 3 hours later, he could not speak. He simply sat in the bottom of a fighting position, staring at nothing, trembling despite the tropical heat. The Marines maintained their fire for 15 minutes total, expending over 350 rounds, then ceased fire on Lieutenant Morrison's command. The forward observer waited, listening for any sign that the Japanese were attempting to reorganize for another assault. There was nothing, only the groans of wounded men in the darkness and the crackle of burning vegetation. The attack had been broken so completely that no follow-up fires were necessary. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Marine patrols moved forward cautiously to assess the damage. What they found confirmed what the artillery crews already knew. The Japanese had never had a chance. Bodies lay in clusters where units had been caught in the open. Equipment was strewn across the impact area: rifles, helmets, packs, entrenching tools. The physical evidence told the story of men who had been advancing in good order and had been caught by precision fire that gave them no time to disperse, no opportunity to take cover, no chance to fight back. This engagement on Bougainville was not unique. It was repeated, with variations, on nearly every island where American and Japanese forces met during the Pacific War. From Tarawa to Saipan, from Peleliu to Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers launched brave, determined attacks into the teeth of American firepower and were destroyed not through lack of courage, but through the overwhelming material superiority of their opponents. The pattern was consistent. Japanese forces, constrained by limited artillery, insufficient ammunition, and a tactical doctrine that emphasized infantry assault, would attack American positions supported by abundant, responsive, devastating artillery fire. The results were predictable and terrible. American after-action reports from Pacific campaigns document this disparity with clinical precision. Japanese artillery-to-infantry ratios were typically 1/3 to 1/5 of American equivalents. Japanese ammunition expenditure per gun per day averaged between 20 and 50 rounds. American batteries routinely fired 500 to 1,000 rounds per gun in major engagements. Japanese fire direction was slow and inflexible. American fire support could be called down within 3 to 5 minutes and shifted rapidly as the tactical situation changed. Japanese soldiers who survived these encounters and were captured or who wrote diaries later recovered from battlefields expressed a consistent theme: shock at the volume and precision of American artillery, and a sense that they had been fighting not against soldiers, but against an impersonal mechanism of destruction. One captured Japanese officer on Saipan told his interrogators that fighting the Americans was like fighting against a steel factory that could throw its production directly at our men. Another diary, found on a Japanese soldier's body on Peleliu, contained an entry that read, "The American artillery never stops. When we attack, it destroys us. When we defend, it pounds us. When we try to move, it follows us. Our guns fire few rounds and fall silent. Their guns fire forever." This was not propaganda or exaggeration. It was a lived reality of Japanese soldiers confronting the vast productive capacity of American industry translated into firepower. The 75mm pack howitzer became, in the minds of many Japanese survivors, a symbol of this disparity. Unlike larger guns that remained hidden behind the lines, the pack howitzer was light enough and mobile enough to be positioned close to the front, sometimes within direct sight of Japanese positions. Japanese soldiers could see the guns, could watch the crews working around them, could observe the steady rhythm of fire that seemed to continue without pause or limit. The gun's distinctive report, sharper and higher pitched than heavier artillery, became a sound that provoked visceral fear among Japanese infantry. In post-war interviews, Japanese veterans of Pacific battles frequently mentioned the small, rapid-fire American guns and described them with a mixture of respect and horror. They understood, at a level that transcended tactical analysis, that these guns represented a form of warfare for which their training and doctrine had not prepared them, a form of warfare in which their courage and skill were rendered almost meaningless by sheer material abundance. The development and deployment of the 75mm pack howitzer also reflected broader truths about the American way of war, truths that Japanese military planners had fundamentally misunderstood. The United States did not approach warfare primarily as a test of spirit or as an arena for demonstrating martial virtue. Americans approached war as a problem to be solved through the application of resources, technology, and systematic organization. The pack howitzer was an engineered solution to a specific problem: how to provide infantry with responsive, powerful, mobile fire support in difficult terrain. Its design reflected careful attention to weight limits, disassembly requirements, ballistic performance, and crew ergonomics. Its production, over 4,500 units manufactured during the war, demonstrated American industrial capacity. Its employment, supported by elaborate fire direction systems, abundant ammunition, and comprehensive communications, showed American organizational skill. And its effect, the systematic destruction of Japanese attacks across the Pacific, proved that this approach to warfare could be devastatingly effective. By late 1944, as American forces drew closer to the Japanese home islands, the disparity in artillery firepower had become so pronounced that Japanese tactical doctrine began to change. Unable to match American firepower, Japanese commanders increasingly adopted purely defensive tactics, abandoning the offensive spirit that had defined their earlier approach. They built elaborate underground fortifications on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, dug their artillery into caves and tunnels, and attempted to engage American forces in grinding attritional battles where Japanese soldiers could exact maximum casualties before inevitable defeat. These tactics were more effective at inflicting casualties, but they represented an implicit acknowledgement that Japanese forces could no longer fight the Americans on equal terms, that the material disparity was simply too great to overcome through tactical skill or fighting spirit. The ideology that had sent Japanese soldiers into battle confident of victory had collided with the reality of American firepower, and the ideology had shattered. Private Yamamoto was evacuated from Bougainville in March 1944, part of general Japanese withdrawal as American forces tightened their grip on the island. He would fight again on Leyte in the Philippines, and there too he would experience the terrible effectiveness of American artillery. He survived the war, though barely, and in the post-war years rarely spoke of his experiences. But in 1968, interviewed by a Japanese historian compiling an oral history of Pacific veterans, Yamamoto described a night on Bougainville with painful clarity. "We were taught that we would win through superior spirit," he said. "We believed that American soldiers were weak, that they relied on machines because they lacked courage. But when their artillery began to fire that night, I understood that we had been deceived. It was not about courage. They had built a machine for killing, and we had brought only our bodies and our belief. We never had a chance." The American crews who served the 75mm pack howitzers rarely understood the psychological impact their weapons had on Japanese forces. For men like Corporal Hargrove, the gun was simply a tool, a piece of equipment to be maintained, aim-placed, fired, and moved as tactical requirements dictated. The Marines trained relentlessly on their guns, learning to disassemble and reassemble them in darkness, to calculate firing data manually if the fire direction center was knocked out, to maintain sustained rates of fire despite heat and fatigue. They developed a professional pride in their weapon and their skill in employing it. But they did not think of themselves as operating an instrument of psychological warfare or as symbols of American industrial might. They were artillerymen doing their jobs, supporting the infantry, firing when and where directed, then cleaning the guns and preparing for the next fire mission. The broader meaning of their work, the way their steady, overwhelming firepower was breaking the will of an enemy army, was not something they spent much time contemplating in the moment. Yet that broader meaning was real and consequential. Every engagement in which American artillery shattered Japanese attacks, every barrage that destroyed Japanese positions, every fire mission that demonstrated the vast disparity in material resources, all of these contributed to a slow but inexorable erosion of Japanese military morale and confidence. Japanese soldiers, no matter how brave or well-trained, could not indefinitely sustain their fighting spirit while being systematically destroyed by an enemy whose material advantages seemed almost limitless. The psychological impact of this disparity was noted by American intelligence officers who analyzed captured documents and interrogated prisoners. By mid-1944, Japanese diaries and letters increasingly contain expressions of despair and fatalism, a sense that they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that could not be defeated through conventional military means. The mythology of Japanese invincibility, so carefully cultivated through the 1930s and early 1940s, crumbled under the weight of American steel. The 75mm pack howitzer continued to serve with distinction through the remainder of the Pacific War and beyond. Marine artillery battalions equipped with these guns participated in every major amphibious operation from Tarawa to Okinawa. The guns proved their worth in the mountains of Italy, where the 10th Mountain Division used them effectively in terrain that defeated heavier weapons. Post-war, they saw service in Korea and even into the early years of Vietnam, before finally being phased out in favor of more modern designs. But their greatest impact was in the Pacific, where they became the infantryman's most reliable and devastating source of fire support, the weapon that could be counted on to break Japanese attacks and reduce Japanese fortifications. The numbers tell the story. Marine pack howitzer battalions fired over 4.7 million rounds during the Pacific War, an average of over 1,000 rounds per gun per year of combat. That expenditure of ammunition, representing millions of pounds of steel and explosives, transported across thousands of miles of ocean, delivered precisely when and where needed, was a feat of logistics and industrial production that no other combatant in the Pacific War could match. In the larger narrative of the Pacific War, the story of Japanese soldiers encountering American artillery firepower is a story about the collision between different philosophies of warfare and different national capacities for industrial production. Japan entered the war believing that superior training, fighting spirit, and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantages. This belief was not entirely unreasonable. It had proven effective in earlier conflicts against opponents with similar limitations. But the United States represented a different kind of opponent, one that could leverage vast industrial resources to produce overwhelming quantities of weapons, ammunition, and supplies, and that had developed the organizational systems to deliver that material to the battlefield and employ it with devastating effect. The pack howitzer was merely one expression of this larger reality, but it was an expression that Japanese soldiers experienced directly and repeatedly, one that forced them to confront the inadequacy of their pre-war assumptions. The crews of Corporal Hargrove's battery continued to operate on Bougainville until the island was secured, then moved on to Guam, then Iwo Jima, firing thousands of rounds, supporting dozens of infantry attacks, breaking countless Japanese counterattacks. For them, the war was a succession of islands, gun positions, fire missions, each similar to the last, each adding to the grinding weight of accumulated experience. Some men were killed, more were wounded, all were changed by what they endured. But they did their jobs with professional competence, maintaining their guns even when rain turned positions to mud, firing accurately even when Japanese counter-battery fire searched for their positions, staying at their posts even when wounded. They were not, by their own estimation, heroes. They were artillerymen, doing the work that artillerymen do in war, delivering fire support to infantry, neutralizing enemy positions, breaking enemy attacks. That their work had profound strategic and psychological consequences was something they would only fully understand years later, when the war was over and historians began to analyze the factors that had determined its outcome. On a February evening in 1945, on a different island in a different campaign, another Japanese soldier crouched in a fighting position and listened to the sound of American artillery preparing the battlefield for tomorrow's infantry assault. He was 19 years old, conscripted 6 months earlier, and he had never been under artillery fire before. As the shells began to fall, systematically, relentlessly, with a steady rhythm of a machine that would not stop, he felt fear unlike anything he had imagined. This was not the war he had been promised, not the glorious test of spirit he had been taught to expect. This was industrial slaughter, impersonal and overwhelming, and he understood with sudden, terrible clarity that he was going to die not in combat, but in an explosion, torn apart by a shell fired by a man he would never see, served by an industrial system he could not comprehend. In the morning, if he survived the night's bombardment, American infantry would advance behind a rolling barrage, and there would be more explosions, more steel fragmenting through the air, more of the grinding mechanical violence that had come to define the Pacific War. He pressed himself deeper into his hole and tried to pray, but the sound of the guns drowned out even thought. The artillery barrage continued tonight, hundreds of rounds seeking out every possible Japanese position, destroying bunkers, collapsing caves, killing men in their fighting positions. Among the guns delivering this fire were 75mm pack howitzers, their barrels growing hot from continuous firing, their crews working steadily through the darkness, loading and firing, and loading again, sustained by coffee and determination, and the knowledge that their fire was saving the lives of the infantrymen who would advance at dawn. When the barrage finally lifted and the infantry moved forward, they would find Japanese positions devastated, defenders dead or so thoroughly stunned that organized resistance was impossible. This was a pattern that had repeated across the Pacific, the pattern that would continue until Japan's final surrender. American firepower, systematically applied, overwhelming Japanese defenses, and Japanese will. In the archives of the National Museum of the Marine Corps, there's a photograph of a 75mm pack howitzer, taken somewhere in the Pacific in 1944. The gun sits in a clearing hacked from jungle, its barrel at rest. Its crew relax around it in the casual poses of men between missions. They are young. Most appear to be in their early 20s, and they look at the camera with expressions that mix pride, exhaustion, and a certain matter-of-fact professionalism. Behind them, stacked on wooden pallets, are dozens of ammunition rounds, ready to be fired when the next mission comes down from the Fire Direction Center. The photograph is not dramatic. There are no explosions, no action, no visible enemy. It is simply a gun and its crew, waiting. But in that image is contained the essential truth of American artillery in the Pacific War, the steady, unglamorous, overwhelming application of firepower, sustained by industrial production and logistical excellence, delivered by trained crews who understood their craft. It was this, not individual heroism, not tactical genius, not superior fighting spirit, that broke the Japanese army and won the island campaigns of the Pacific. Years after the war, a Marine veteran who had served on a pack howitzer crew on Okinawa was asked what he remembered most about his time in combat. He thought for a long moment before answering. "The weight of the shells," he said finally. "After a fire mission, your arms would ache from loading them. They were heavy, 14 pounds each, and you load dozens of them one after another as fast as you could work. Your whole world narrowed down to that rhythm. Receive the round, set in the breech, step back, fire, reload. We did it so many times it became automatic. But later, after the war, I'd sometimes think about those shells, about the weight of them, and about how each one represented steel and explosives manufactured in some factory back home, shipped across thousands of miles of ocean, delivered to us in the jungle, and fire at men we never saw. That's what I remember. Not the enemy, not the fear, not the danger, but the sheer material reality of it, the weight of all that steel we threw at them day after day until it was over. This is what Japanese soldiers encounter when they face American artillery in the Pacific. Not merely weapons, but the accumulated weight of American industrial capacity, transformed into explosive shells and delivered with precision and abundance that their own forces could never match. The 75mm pack howitzer was the instrument, but behind it stood factories, ships, trucks, communications networks, fire direction centers, ammunition dumps, and supply chains that stretched back 6,000 miles to the American heartland. It was a system of warfare that the Imperial Japanese Army, for all its courage and tactical skill, had no answer for. And in the end, that made all the difference.